In this lesson, we're learning how to think of multiplication as making copies, okay? So we have 4 times 8 here. What we're going to think is that's 4 copies of 8, okay? And the diagram we draw is given here. We have an 8, and then another 8, and then another 8, and then another 8. We're not looking for the answer, which would be 32, right? Because 8, 8, 8, and 8 combined together make 32. We're just learning to think about expressions like this as copies, okay? So this is 4 copies of 8. Over here, we would think 3 copies of 7, okay? So that here they are, 7 and another 7 and another 7. So our task is to do the same thing for this example and this example, right? So if we think 4 copies of 8 here, and we think 3 copies of 7 here, what would we think here? 5 copies of 2. And we would draw a diagram like this. 1 box, 2 boxes, 3 boxes, 4 boxes, and 5 boxes, right? Because we're making 5 copies of 2. And that's what it's asking us to do. Just think about it as 5 copies of 2. Now, what would we think for this one? 6 copies of 11. So we're going to draw 6 boxes, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 copies of 11. Okay, so the whole purpose of this piece is just to kind of get your mind thinking about multiplication as making copies of a number, okay? Now the next piece expands on that, all right? So it says here are 3 different ways to make 5 times 3. In other words, to make 5 copies of 3. And then it says find another way to make 5 copies of 3. That's down here. So let's take a look at what this shows us. The first one is just what we just did, right? 5 copies of 3. 5 times 3, we've got, 5 boxes, each have 3 in them. But let's look at what's going on over here, because this looks a lot more complicated. But if we read into it and see what to think, it's actually not as complicated as it seems, right? If we just look at what's inside this first parenthesis here, right? Inside this first set of parentheses, that just is 4 times 3. So that is just 4 copies of 3. And if we look at what's in the second parentheses, right? That's 1 times 3. So that's 1 copy of 3. And in between these two expressions, we have a plus sign. So we can think of this as simply 4 copies of 3 plus 1 copy of 3. Okay, and that's what it tells us to think right here. Think 4 copies of 3 plus 1 copy of 3. And that's what the diagram shows. Now notice, this is the same thing as making 5 copies of 3, right? If you make 4 copies of 3, and then you add to that 1 more copy of 3, right? That makes 5 copies of 3. So again, training our minds to see this seemingly complicated expression as simply 4 copies of 3 plus another 1 copy of 3, which makes 5 copies of 3. Now let's come down and take a look at this one. Okay, again, it looks similar to this. We have 7 times 3 in parentheses, then a minus sign, and then 2 times 3 inside of the parentheses. But again, this first piece here, if we look inside the parentheses, it's just 7 times 3. So that's just 7 copies of 3. And if we look at the second set here, that's just 2 times 3, or 2 copies of 3. Okay, and in between we have a minus sign. So we think 7 copies of 3 minus 2 copies of 3. And the diagram shows this thinking. First we had 7 copies of 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then we're subtracting or taking away or removing 2 copies of 3. 1 copy, 2 copies, X out. What's left? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 copies of 3, which is the same as up here. So again, this is just another way to show 5 copies of 3. We start with 7 copies of 3, and we take away 2 copies of 3. And the last piece here is to try to make up our own example, okay? So there's a lot of ways to do it. You can use addition, start with a certain number of 3s, and then add some more to make 5, or subtraction. I'm gonna go with addition. I'm gonna start out with 2 copies of 3, okay? So that's 2 copies of 3. 3 and 3. And then I'm going to add to that, how many more copies of 3 would I need to add in order to make it 5 copies of 3? If you said 3 copies of 3, you got it. So we're going to add to it 3 more copies of 3. And that's just another way to show 5 copies of 3. So there you have it.